Thanks so much, Howard. Howard Bell. Look, for somebody like me to have Howard give an introduction like that is just a gift. I do count Howard as a friend of mine, and I'm going to make sure whenever I take him and I need to be introduced, I'm going to take Howard along in the future. Because that was fantastic. It was very generous. I want to thank the organising committee and Howard for inviting me along. And it's great to be able to talk to you as a Labor politician about Labor's view of the world and particularly about this topic of affordable housing. Friends, secure housing, I think we would all agree, is fundamental to a decent society. And if we want to have a properly functioning economy, it's also fundamental that those who participate in the economy have a decent home base to work from. A secure house has to be affordable. Whether it's rented or owner occupied, affordability is a very important part of making housing secure. And I think, as the professor has indicated, there's an abundance of evidence to suggest that secure, affordable housing is certainly beyond the reach of many in this state right now. And before I talk more about that, let me, by way of introduction, I guess, talk about Labor's past in this area. Labor's always been committed to ensuring that people have access to decent, secure housing. And I'm reminded that the first Labor government in New South Wales, the government of Jim McGowan, introduced the first public housing in New South Wales. It's still there at Daceyville. They were committed to building such good quality housing for ordinary people that housing is still there and it's still a model garden suburb. The McKell, Daceyville, 1912. Sorry. The McKell government, 1941, created the Housing Commission. At the time, McKell said the purpose of the Housing Commission was to provide a good, cheap home, either for rental purpose for people employed around the basic wage. It was about housing for working people on ordinary incomes. And with the impetus that followed World War II, during those times we were more comfortable with the state providing services in our society. We'd just gone through a war where the state had operated the economy remarkably well, employing everybody and providing for all, that after the war we were quite happy to have that occur as a continuum, even with federal Conservative governments. During the 50s, 60s, 70s, housing provision in this state was 20% by the state. And that wasn't social housing, which is what the norm is today. It was housing for ordinary people. More recently, in terms of Labor's approach to affordable housing, and the professor referred to this, and if you read today's Sydney Morning Herald, you would have seen a preview of the comments that the Shadow Federal Treasurer Chris Barn will make next week on the issue. He said that we are becoming a nation that can no longer house its own children. Labor took a very brave policy approach to the last federal election to try and address the key issue that we can do federally to address the housing affordability issue, and that's to attack the tax and the tax problem and the negative gearing problem around housing. The capital gains tax credit around the capital gain that accrues to housing, investment housing, is such that there is such an incredible incentive for people to get into housing, not as a home, for the provision of a home, but as an investment which they can accrue wealth on. Labor was the only sensible party at the federal election to try and address that at the last federal election. So those are my introductory comments. I just want to make a few observations to build on that. This isn't just a Sydney problem. That's my first observation. I come from the Central Coast. The problem that people in Sydney are experiencing is also experienced in the wider regions of New South Wales. It was illustrated recently by an article in my local paper where the journalist observed that 17 of the 36 recent properties sold were snapped up by Sydney buyers. 6 were bought by local purchasers, 5 by interstate investors, 4 by overseas buyers, and 4 unknown. Local people in my area are being priced out of the housing market. People in Sydney who are feeling pressure in this area are cashing in the capital gain on their owner-occupied home, selling up, moving to an area like mine where they can purchase a better home in a cheaper environment. But in doing so, they displace people in my area who traditionally relied on the affordable housing that saw myself and Howard move into the area some 20, 30 years ago. And the nature of the problem is quite stark. Consider this, sales prices of housing have continued, and the professor indicated, despite increases in supply, house prices have continued to grow at significant rates. The last 12 months by over 8% in the Greater Sydney area. That includes the Central Coast and Wollongong and Newcastle, most of New South Wales. During that same period, rents have increased 4%. Wages, on the other hand, have only increased a bit over 2%. With that sort of disparity in growth between prices and wages, increases above inflation, then it's easy to see why most of us are heading towards housing stress, not away from it. What is the Liberal approach? What is the Conservative approach? The Professor talked a bit about that. Since winning government in 2011, I think the Minister for Social Housing, Brad Hazzard, was referred to today. That's part of the problem. Since winning government, it's all been about housing supply. The Treasurer has said a number of times the most effective way we can tackle housing affordability is to increase supply. And there has been a big increase in supply. You've got it across the road. You've got all these units where there used to be Harold Park Racecourse. We've had a bunch of building in New South Wales, but prices have gone up at a greater rate. The figure I saw recently, prices have gone up 40% since 2011, even though dwelling completions have increased by over 80%. So even though we're building a whole bunch of dwellings, more dwellings than ever before, prices have kept pace with that and pricing people out of the market. What should we do about it? And look, these comments are my own, and I'll preface them by saying that, but also noting that at a state level, there's a real commitment to do something about the housing affordability problem. Our Shadow Minister has issued a discussion paper on the issue. We had a long discussion about it when the caucus met in Wollongong on the weekend, and we are heading decisively, I think, towards some very strong policies. Certainly, we're talking about, we will have a housing minister, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We will have a target for affordable housing, and there's going to be a bunch of other stuff we will roll out that we think will really squarely address housing affordability in New South Wales. But from my point of view, we do need to address the tax and capital gains issues at that federal level, and that'll come. And I think, to his credit, Chris Bowen has shown, even though Labor didn't quite win the last election, they are still going to push those principled issues that they see as important to making sure housing's affordable for all of us. At a state level, we need a housing minister. What we've got at the moment is a Minister for Social Housing, and that's Brad Hazzard. His job is what used to be called public housing. Now, public housing doesn't exist anymore. It's housing that's provided for people who are in receipt of social security. The number of people who earn a wage that live in public housing is insignificant now. In my area, there is one person, apparently. Other than that, the people who occupy public housing are in receipt of social security benefits. Most of them in my area are pensioners. The receipts on rent from those people are not sustainable when we talk about renewing that housing. It's enough barely to maintain the housing, but it's certainly not enough to renew and build more social housing. And that's what we need to do. So we need a minister who's responsible for housing across the state and then can be held accountable for a lack of affordable housing. There is nobody accountable at the moment. The government at large is, but we cannot point to one single individual who is directly responsible for the provision of affordable housing for all, and I think a future Labor government will do that. That's certainly something I'd like to see provided by a future state government. We also need to look at what's called inclusionary zoning. It's operating on a very small scale at the moment. So when we have a new development like the one across the road where there's a whole bunch of dwellings in a location, a certain percentage are quarantined for people of a certain income. And it could be 10%, 20%, 30%, and there could be various rules applied around it. The projects where it has been implemented at the moment have been successful, but the numbers are so very small that they are insignificant in terms of their impact on the wider dysfunctional housing market. We should apply an inclusionary zoning principle across the board. Any new development should provide at least a percentage of affordable housing administered in some way through various rules, but it's all possible. We do it now. We could do it across the board, and when it's applied across the board, developers know in advance what the rules are and it can be factored in to the market. The state should return to the provision of housing. The state has vacated that space. The current developer of land in New South Wales, what used to be called Landcom, is now called Urban Growth. They operate as a private company. They are required to provide a dividend to the government. When state governments are constrained in the income they can receive, there's a whole bunch of pressure put on state corporations to increase the dividends they provide the state. There is no competition out there between the public provider, the public developer and private developers. The state should return to that space, start building and developing land which is released to the public on an affordable level. And you can put rules around it and you can put access rules around it. It's totally possible, totally doable. We used to do it in a smaller, as I said, during the 50s and 60s we did it. We can do it again, and then it will have a big impact on the housing market in New South Wales. We can conduct the development of the state on a cost recovery or not-for-profit basis rather than the existing basis whereby the public provider is required to provide a dividend or a profit to the state for general revenue. We can do more for renters. The Residential Tenancies Act is up for review at the moment, and the minister responsible is a good guy, but he hasn't proposed many changes to the existing provision, which offers very little security to tenants. Once your tenancy agreement has expired and you're on an ongoing agreement, you can be terminated from your tenancy with 90 days notice. It's not much notice, especially when it's hard to find rental accommodation. If your landlord defaults on his mortgage or her mortgage, then you can be terminated with 30 days notice. And I've had just the other week a lady who had signed a lease. She'd signed a 6 months lease for a unit on the Central Coast in the entrance, but her landlord defaulted on his mortgage and she was instantly served a 30-day notice to vacate. Can you imagine the distress that woman was in? She just signed a lease, paid her bond, gone through all that, the whole expense of moving from the other place to this place, and to be offered, to be confronted with no questions asked, a letter served, you've got to get out in 30 days. So we can certainly do more to protect existing tenants, We can at the very least increase the notice period applied to people. The tenants' union has what I think is a great idea to make tenancy protected, and tenants can only be evicted if the landlord goes to the administration tribunal and gets an order for eviction. So there's a bunch more we can do there with the Residential Tenancies Act. Finally, and look, this is a long-term, this should be something that's a long-term aim of public policy, and the Professor touched upon it. We've got to get away from the idea, and we all have it, you know, in our bones, I guess, and it's something that's built up since we settled in this country. We've got to get away from the idea that our house is an investment. Our house is a home, and that's the way we should think about it, but too many of us think of that house that we live in as also an investment which we can obtain a capital return on at some stage in our life. When we can, as we continue to think about that, it's going to be awfully difficult to push a large group of the public towards the idea that we should be aiming to provide homes to people on the basis of need rather than houses on the basis that you might get a capital gain on it and it's an investment property that you happen to live in for a certain period of your life. So that's my ideas. I'm more than happy to share them with you. I hope you found it reasonably interesting, and thanks so much.